starting Unit 3 of Credit Recovery World History. And this is going to be the last unit of this first quarter. And we're going to be looking at four different groups of people, okay, that kind of emerged after the fall of Rome, which I'll talk about here shortly. But we're going to be looking at European feudalism and what's known as the Dark Ages. So, with that, we're going to have a new standard. Yes, you can keep looking at causes and effects. That is going to work. However, we're going to look at cultural advancements within societies. So, again, four groups of people, first being the Europeans. What did they do to advance culture? And we're going to look at different religions that are formed. We're going to look at ways of thinking, and then culture, and then education all along the way from the different groups. We're also going to look at global catastrophes and how they were either human made or they just naturally occurred. So, with that, I want you to listen for the cultural advancements in Europe during the time period known as the Middle Ages. So, the fall of Rome is a big deal to most history people because this is the transition from one era to the next, from ancient to Middle Ages, or classical to post classicals. Whichever way you want to remember it, you do you. However, the fall of Rome kind of left a big hole, I guess you would say. And with the Roman Empire, there was an army that would protect its borders for a long time until the end, which you learned. However, you're going to notice that when the Roman Empire falls, the land, which is all has color here, is going to be broken apart from the wealthy landowners. And people that were wealthiest during the time are going to eventually put themselves king of their land. So this is where kingdoms start, where early countries are going to kind of be formed, or territories, however you want to word it. So this is going to set off a chain of events known as feudalism. But in this time, like I said, when the Roman Empire fell, there's no protection. So outside people are invading this area quite often. So down here, you have the Muslims. Down in the east, there's going to be from the Magyars. And then from the north is from the Vikings. And if we had more time, we would definitely dive into the Vikings because they're a really interesting crew. However, for our purposes, in this area of the world, no protection, people having a lot of land and constantly being robbed or looted is going to lead into what the point of is of today. So the Middle Ages began with the fall of which country? Okay, so here is the main event, I guess you would today. Feudalism. European times in the Middle Ages is going to lead to feudalism, and it all bases on land control and protection. Cannot stress that enough. Land is the main currency of the time, along with labor, and then it's a set of agreements one's going to protect the other, or I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine mentality. And then here is the chain or the pyramid or whatever you want to call it, how it all works out. So I'm going to break these down just a little bit further so you can kind of understand how it all works. So at the start is the king. The king is a king. You guys know how it all works. King is usually the top dog type of government, and they call the shots. They own all the land. But there's a problem. They don't have an army to protect their land from the Vikings and the Magyars and the Muslim map I showed you earlier. So what they do is that they give land to what's called lords or landlords to go out and find an army. So they're going to give a chunk of their land to these people to go out and find people to protect their land. So the landlords. So what their role is to basically do whatever the king says. They go out and collect taxes. They go out and find people that are going to be serving as knights or the army, I guess you would say, kind of equivalent, but not quite. And then all the while, they're going to have people under them that works for them. So they're going to take a chunk of the land that the king gave them, and then they're going to divide it out as currency of, hey, I'll give you this land if you protect the king and myself. Okay, so the kings are obviously very rich. The lords are also very rich. And then how did they usually get this gig? Is that usually they're friends of the king or their families or friends or whichever. So the next chain is going to be, simply put, the knights. But here's the manner. This is what that chunk of land would look like. And if you look all the way down here, you notice this is basically what they need to survive. They never have a reason to leave the manor. And as you're going to notice when we get down to the peasants, they work such long days, they don't have time to leave the manor. But like I said before, here are the knights. And then the knights, if you've ever seen any of the various movies, they're fairly close. They're usually educated people. They're usually also are pretty wealthy because they own land. They're going to have people that work directly underneath them that are travel with them, kind of like apprentices or knights in training, if you will. But the catch was is that they had to be available at any time to go off and protect the king's land, protect the lords, or whichever. So this was kind of a demanding role in the times of feudalism. But again, this was kind of the equivalent of their army. So that way they had protection. And at the bottom of the social rung is going to be the peasants or the serfs. They're usually can be called either way. But what they are going to be is the hard laborers, if you will. They are the ones that are going to be in the majority of the population. They're going to be fairly poor and they're going to have very little to eat, and their way of life sucked. They did not have a whole lot of time left in their day outside of farming the fields by hand and doing whatever was being asked of them or servants or whichever. So, with that, you're going to notice that their way of life again, doesn't leave a whole lot of room for culture to advance. And I'm going to talk about that here in a little bit. But it's important to note that they were not slaves. They got something in return. They did not just work because they were told to work, they were given protection. In a time of no Roman Empire army, as I said, people are vulnerable and people don't want to be taken over. So, therefore, that's why all this is not slavery. So, landlords and peasants, they usually had a contract, meaning that if they violated the terms of the contract, they could actually be free to go and work for other people, if in some cases. But again, all things were settled by the king. So more times than not, it didn't work out for them. But again, they just accepted this. So that's why how they rolled. So here's my question: blank and blank were at the center of feudalism. So, as I said, it's worth noting that these peasants, when they were working, they didn't really have time to sit down and write a poem or draw a picture or anything like that. When you think of what culture was really going on during the time, or think about scientific breakthroughs or why man exists and stuff like that, that you're going to see later in the Renaissance, they just basically accepted it as God's will, and then they just had the goal of surviving every day. So, I can assure you, during this time period, life was not good. But it's also worth noting during this time that, again, religion is the center of everybody's life. So they didn't question any of it because this is the position that God put them in. But it's also worth noting during this time that the church was starting to be pretty corrupt. They were starting to see themselves that they had a lot of power, and people are going to take advantage of that. And one of the most corrupt people during the time was the Pope. They were seeing themselves as basically God on earth, and people really usually didn't question them. To be continued when we get to the Reformation in Unit 4, if you need to do it. So, what brought about this way of life? Or what brought it to an end? Excuse me. What brought it to an end? That feudalism is going to be three things. The Magna Carta. So, this is a historical document from the 1200s that's going to take power away from the kings. Okay, this is going to be the equivalent of our checks and balances today. So, why this is that people are no longer going to have to do exactly what the king says because they had the strength in numbers. They didn't have to. So it took them a while to realize that, but once they did, they did. The Hundred Years' War. So this event, it wasn't so much the event, but what it brought about. The technologies of war, in particular the longbow. This was cheaper to make. The arrows were cheaper to make and highly effective. They could go right through the suit of armor that knights would wear. So it made them knights obsolete. And the king could then just hire a bunch of archers or soldiers, for lack of a better term, to go out and fight without giving land. So that kind of shifted. And in the textbook that's attached to this lesson, it explains that very well. And the bubonic plague. So this is actually something that really needs to be broken down a little bit more given the time period of COVID that we're in. But what this bubonic plague is basically a highly infectious disease. Okay, if you were to, and it's all centers around bacteria, if you will. Okay, if you want to go that way, and it gets in the blood. So it's about a 20-year stretch where you're going to notice that if you had a fever, gangrene is when your skin rots pretty much, fever, chills, cramps, seizures, and like when these glands would swell up and to the point where they bust, that was the Black Death. And then once you got it, you didn't recover from it. It basically got you. So it was carried around on fleas and rats. So this is a big deal because during this time there was trash everywhere, which is breeding ground for fleas and rats. And before the times of personal hygiene, fleas were most likely on people all the time. So where did it come from? Historians have traced it back to China, Asia, and thanks to the Silk Road, thanks to international travel now, it was carried to different parts around Europe, Middle East, and you're going to notice that this is going to be talked about quite a bit and refer back to quite a bit. But again, this is kind of like what we're experiencing today, where because we're all connected in the globe, one disease starts in one area of the world, it's going to go to all other parts of the world. So, what were the effects? Well, the feudalism ended. I already talked about this bottom part because people were in such high demand that they could leave their contract whenever they wanted to and guaranteed to find another job. But it also killed one third of Europe's population. And then I'm not even talking about the other parts of Asia and such because I don't have those numbers in front of me. But in Europe, when 50 to 75 million people died, that is monumental. So I hate to say it this way, but the effects of COVID with people dying, it's not even a blip on the bubonic plague's radar quite yet. So, why is this all called the Dark Ages? Notice how, again, I didn't talk about a whole lot of cultural advancement. And when we're coming from the Greeks and the Romans, what was seen as the light of culture, this guy right here, Francisco Pederich, which I'm going to talk about more in the Renaissance, he described it as dark. So it just kind of really caught on. But again, when you go into what was not happening, it's pretty easy to understand why this is called the Dark Ages, where nothing really positive was really happening. So, in the future lessons, I'm going to challenge, is this really a dark age or just a dark age in Europe? So, here's my question. This time period was called the Dark Ages because of the supposed absence of